Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. The retirement age here in France is to be raised from 62 to 64. That's the big announcement today. The Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne revealing the plan. It's part of the reforms President Emmanuel Macron's been considering since he was first elected back in 2017. The issue of changing the pension system in France is an explosive one. It's been a rolling topic on the agenda of successive presidents and governments since 1993, perhaps even before that. Each time there were strikes against. This time there are already stoppages being called for by the Big Eight unions for January the 19th or the 24th. This is to be confirmed, but it's looking very likely. One union leader says if Emmanuel Macron wants to carry out the, as he called it, mother of all reforms, we will fight the mother of all battles. Those are the words of Frédéric Souillot of the Force Ouvrière Union. It's easy to predict workers in the public transport, especially trains and metro, plus the energy sector will be affected badly by this. We're here to discuss the issues. Four panellists with a regard on the issue. Joining us in the studio, Charlotte Minviel, who is co-chair of the French Green Party in the UK. Charlotte, thank you so much for being with us. Good evening to you. Thierry Masson joins us from Brussels. He is president of French people living abroad. Thierry Masson, thank you for being with us too. Dr. Andrew Smith, lecturer in modern French history, is standing by at Queen's in London. Andrew, thanks for being with us again. And Ronald Fulkar is a senior lecturer at Lancaster University's Management School up there in Lancaster in the good old northwest of England. One of my old stomping grounds. Great place to be. Before I let the panel loose on these issues, let's hear from Elisabeth Borne speaking a little earlier about the reforms.
From the 1st of September, the legal age of retirement will be gradually increased by 3 months every year to reach 64 years in 2030. With a legal retirement age of 64 in 2030 and 43 years of contributions, the objective will then be reached, and our distribution system will have reached an equilibrium. In keeping with our commitments, employees and self-employed people, especially small-scale workers who have worked their whole lives with minimum wages, will now receive a pension of 85% of the net minimum wage. That's equivalent to an increase of €100 per month. They will therefore receive almost €1,200 per month from this year.
Elisabeth Borne, the French Prime Minister, there seems to be something for everybody in this, but nonetheless that headline issue of raising the retirement age is something that all the unions have spoken out against before the announcements were made. So we wait to see what their response will be, though I think, Charlotte Minviel, it might be predictable. We could be seeing possibly industrial disputes, strikes ahead.
Definitely, I think so. 68% of French people are against this reform. It's very unpopular, and rightly so. This reform is not a necessity. It's really a political choice, and it's a conservative political choice. It's a reform that actually is targeted not at the people who may have done 5 years of studies and who have a master's degrees and who are anyway going to leave and to go on retirement at 65. It's really targeted to actually the poorest people who have started to work early and who then are going to have to contribute actually further and longer to pay for the retirement of those people who are in higher employed jobs. And it's truly unfair. And I think it's really important to remember that actually 25% of the poorest men in our society are actually dying before they reach the age of 62. So there's huge equality in terms of access to good quality of life at the age of retirement. And it's those people who have worked in most hard jobs and really jobs that are most painful and that actually have illnesses or accident risks, etc., which are going to suffer from this reform. And so that's really why I think it's unfair. We actually saw that in 2018, President Macron had already taken away some of the painful criteria certain things like being exposed to toxic products, heavy lifting, etc., no longer entitles you to be able to leave early. So now this is really going to have an impact on people's well-being and take away some time that they could have for rest, for leisure, and there's a huge equality in terms of how this reform is addressed.
Because, Charlotte, when Emmanuel Macron did that, I mean, he obviously pointed to the fact that his grandfather was a train driver. He said the train driver's special regime for pensions is outdated and should be changed. But you're saying that it actually went a lot further, and people in jobs that maybe should be, in your opinion, taken into account, they no longer have that kind of benefit.
Exactly. So, for example, some of the criteria that was taken away is, for example, heavy lifting, exposure to toxic products. And actually, those jobs are jobs such as cleaners or workers in the care system. And they're actually overwhelmingly feminine jobs. So women will be most affected by this change in criteria, which previously happened. So they're going to have to work longer and be most impacted by this. So I think there is going to be an uprising in society. There's going to be huge mobilization. All of the unions, and it hasn't happened in 12 years, that all of the unions are in agreement over opposition over such a reform. So Emmanuel Macron is really, and Elisabeth Borne are proposing a reform that I think is really taking us backward and not forward.
Charlotte, thank you for now very much indeed. Let's bring in Thierry Masson, President of French People Living Abroad. Thierry joining us from Brussels. Thierry, thanks for being with us. The head of the CFDT union, which is, I think, the most moderate one in France, Laurent Berger, he was saying that in his discussions with Emmanuel Macron, it was like two people whose ears were turned away from one another, basically a conversation des sourds, I think was how he put it. Basically, that's one of the issues. What one side wants, the other side doesn't want to listen to.
Thank you very much. It was interesting to hear my colleague from the Greens. If we look at the polls, if we look at the numbers, indeed we see that there is an opposition to the reform on the question of the legal age. That's clear. If you look further on the poll, you also see that 62% of the French people don't trust the left to lead a reform that would solve the issue that we have. Just for the point on the polls. But we have a need for a reform. Why? Because if we keep the system as we have it now, in 2035, we will have a 30.5 billion euro deficit. If we continue with the same system, we could reach 20 million 5 years later, which means it's twice the budget of the justice. Who will pay for that? And I understand the fact that there are a lot of opposition, but being in the government also means take decisions, which sometimes are complicated. I would be very interested to hear what would be the alternative solutions. An alternative solution would be to say, okay, we can also decrease the pensions and have the people get less money when they go retired. When you speak to young people in France now, more and more, there is this little music that they will not have any pension. And that's, we can't accept that. We can't accept the fact that people start to believe that they will not have any pension. What we need to do is to defend the system. We have a system which is one of the most generous in the world, and that's a good thing. But we need to take decisions in order to preserve it. We need to protect this system, and that's what the reform tries to do.
Thierry, for now, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Ronald Fulkar, who's a senior lecturer at Lancaster University's Management School. One of these things, I mean, management's probably the key, isn't it? How you manage your finances. I mean, if you look at how money is spent, Ronald, clearly if governments decide to spend more money on pensions, they can, can't they? It's a question of what priorities are. But Elisabeth Borne today talking about if these things are changed and people work a bit longer, it could release a whole load of money to pay for the reforms. Are you convinced by that?
Well, I'm convinced by one point of each of the two previous speakers. I'm totally in agreement with Charlotte that the reform, the proposed reform, the way it's proposed to be done is a very direct and unsophisticated way of doing so that treats differently different people. It's very different from what Macron was proposing in 2017, which was to have a new point system in which each year would be treated the same for everyone. So in that sense, he couldn't make a deal in 2017 with the left. So now he's making a deal with the right, and that policy is a standard right-wing way of doing it. But I'm also totally in agreement with Thierry that the system at the moment, if you don't do anything, it means there is a choice. there's a choice that you would spend much more public money into the pension, which means it's money you cannot spend on other public services. So somehow the current situation is the failure of 2017 Macron, who spent a lot of time in meetings, in trying to organize this system that in the end, at the time, he was in agreement with the CFDT. So there were plans to work with the union, but it failed. I don't know, the blame could be on either, but it failed. And so at the moment, the pension that he thinks can pass, and I think it will go through relatively smoothly, at least it will be much easier than in 2017, is a reform in which you will have a majority with the right, with a very standard way of doing, which is very close to what Sarkozy was doing when he did the reform. If you compare with what François Hollande did, for instance, with Madame Tourande, Minister Tourande, that was a very different approach in which also the retired people contributed. In this case, the retired people are largely protected. So it's really an intergenerational justice problem in which the people who are going to pay are the current worker for the current retired people.
Indeed. Are you saying that Renaud, if I'm hearing correctly, you're comparing Macron's standpoint to that of Sarkozy back in the day of travailler plus pour gagner plus, work more to earn more? Empty words, finally, weren't they?
Well, in the end, I think Macron started his career as in the continuation of Hollande, and now it's more in the continuation of Sarkozy in terms of thinking about reform. But again, the problem is that he couldn't find a deal on the left back in the time, and now he's going to a very standard Sarkozyan type of reform that will be very polarizing, right against left. But in 2017, everyone was against Macron in the end. Here, it will be a standard right against left, and typically those kind of things go through.
Indeed. And of course, what we saw then was demonstrations in the streets, which we expect will happen again. Let's bring in Dr. Andrew Smith. Renaud, thank you very much indeed for that first contribution. Let's bring in Dr. Andrew Smith, lecturer in modern French history at Queen Mary's in London. Andrew, great to see you again. The title of this debate is basically Macron between a rock and a hard place. He wouldn't be the first president, and it's already happened to him, to have fallen upon the rocks that are pension reform, because successive governments going back many, many years have had problems in trying to reform the system.
Absolutely. I mean, we know he started the year. This was his New Year's resolution that he announced in his New Year's address. It's been flagged up for a long time. I think, of course, we mentioned there the kind of the history, that long history of attempts to reform the system. Of course, we spoke about Marisol Touraine. Of course, the idea of making it the kind of technical reforms that maybe faced slightly less protest because they were that kind of that technical look to them. Going back further to Sarkozy raising the age to 62, the retirement age, which of course saw a lot of people out in the streets. But 3 million people took to the streets in protest. But Sarkozy pushed it through in terms of government was really working to a deadline on that. We can look back look back further still, I should say, to see where that failed. Of course, famously, Alain Juppé's attempt to extend the kind of contribution period as well dramatically failed those reforms in 1995. Now, of course, one of the things you can see there is, of course, Juppé's reform were in part because of budgetary pressures, but also because of the pressure of European integration and the Maastricht Plan and trying to really kind of make France one of these European leaders in that sense. And we can see, of course, that Macron has one eye on this as well. We're talking about France's kind of social issues, its social compact, the idea of those rights associated with France's social agreements. But at the same time, Macron looks towards this idea of leading Europe at the same time. And to do that, France needs to square that budget and to really try to eradicate that deficit. So I think he will be hoping, and I think you're absolutely right there to talk about, cleaving towards the reforms of Sarkozy. We know this has been pushed through with the Republicans. They got pretty much everything they wanted. What was it? They wanted the age was 63 by 2027, then 64 in 2032. Instead, they've got, in 2030. So really, they've given up very little. They got the guarantees, they got all of that. So this very much looks like a reform of the right, where he's done a deal on the basis of the Republican support, and he's going to be hoping that he can push it through, much like Sarkozy did, and weather the storm that will come.
Andrew, thank you. Bear with us. We'll be back to you very shortly. Charlotte Minviel, can I come to you here again? And just to recap for people who may just be joining us, the idea is to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 by 2030. And the number of years you have to contribute to 43 by 2027, which if you do the maths, I think adds up to you're going to work to your quite beyond what you do now anyway, if you just implement the 43 years. One thing that Elisabeth Borne did say was those people who are on minimum wage or earn less, they will be helped. Are you convinced by what she has to say?
No, I'm not convinced by what she has to say. I mean, that's a small increase in when we look at the current situation with inflation. And, you know, on the left, the Greens, we want that to be raised further, of course, so that people actually are not living in poverty when they actually get to the age of being able to have access to a pension. And I'd like to come back to what Andrew and Renaud were saying about the fact that this is really a reform of the right. This is a deal with the Conservatives. There is no urgency. I have to say this again. There's no necessity to put this reform in place. And actually the report of experts on pensions has told us that, yes, there is a little bit of a gap currently in this current situation, but let's put that into perspective. We have actually supported with billions during the COVID crisis a lot of industries. You know, we lended 5 billion to Air France, for example. I mean, that's only one example, but you know, we've done a lot to support in this area. And in proportion, you know, our pensions system represents 14% of our GDP, and this gap is 0.1. There's lots of ways in which we can look to taxing companies, taxing higher earners to make this fairer. And actually, it shows that this dip at the moment is going to stabilize with our change in demographics. So there is no need to do this right now. And I think we should take pride in the current system that we have. This is a strong pension system, one of the most supportive ones in Europe, that's true. But, you know, there's lots of areas where actually other European countries are more progressive. If we look at, for example, parental leave, Sweden is doing much better. If we look at supporting younger people with income, Germany or the Netherlands is doing better. So we're often taken to the idea of international comparisons and how we should think about that. But actually, we should be proud of the fact that we have a system that's sustainable, that's stable, and that we can continue with this age of 62 and with the 40 years of contribution. We don't need to change this right now.
It's sustainable, you say, Charlotte. Elisabeth Borne says it isn't, and things have to be done and adjusted. I think it boils down to politically what the will is to spend in certain places. And I hear precisely what you're saying from the Greens' perspective. Thierry Masson, could I bring you back in? French people living abroad, joining us from Brussels. Charlotte here, bringing up the idea of how other countries compare. France clearly is a place across Europe where people do not work as much as in other countries. Is there a case that France should be brought into line with other countries, do you think?
No, the comparison is actually quite interesting indeed. And it gives a very good idea of the state of the left in France. If I compare with the reform that Zapatero did in 2011 in Spain, the reform that are also in discussion now in Spain by the socialist government, if I see the program of the left parties in Germany, none of these governments decided to diminish the legal age for retiring, as the far-left coalition proposed during the general elections. So we have a left in France who is completely out of realities in terms of what to do in order to solve the situation. I heard in what my colleagues from the Greens said, a lot of time taxes. That's the solution that they have in order to solve the issue. Tax company, tax people, that's how you can balance the system. There is a commitment that Emmanuel Macron has taken is not to raise the taxes. And we will keep this commitment during the mandate. That means the best way to act is to act directly on the legal age. Second point, my colleague was also mentioning the reaction that we had at the European level during the COVID. Why did we manage in the European Union to take these measures in order to respond to the COVID crisis? Because France is today seen as a trusted partner. It's seen as a partner who is able to undertake reform, the reform which are necessary. We managed in the first term of Emmanuel Macron to reform the labor market, to take courageous reform as well. This led to the unemployment rate that we have now, the unemployment rate which is the lowest we have since 15 years, the lowest we have since 40 years for the young people. All of this because we undertook this reform. So this money is not coming just like that. It's coming because Macron is seen as a trusted partner. How would Emmanuel Macron be seen by the other partners who are taking the requirements, their retirement at 60, 67, 65, if he would now decide, as the far-left coalition, the NUP was proposing, to go to 60 years? So the solution that we have pushed and what we managed to do at the European level is precisely because we are seen as a trusted partner, and I want this to continue, and that's why I think we have a good reform. And just one point on the justice. The reform is based on justice and social progress. And you will see with the raising of the minimum level for the people who have the low pension. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
So that's
yes.
In particular the independent worker, the self-employed, and the women. For these people in particular, we will raise the level of the pension, and that's something that will, in particular, be good for the women. And I'm very surprised that this kind of reform is not supported. And just to finish the point, this is a proposal. There is a debate. There is a parliament. The parliament is here also to discuss. And I hope that there will be a commitment not only to just say to the trade unions and to the French to go in the street, but to work and to work openly. There is a possibility to adapt the reform. There are amendments possible. I want this to be seen also as a process where all political parties can intervene.
Indeed, and let's hope that happens and it's not forced through by, essentially a decree. As you were talking, Thierry, news drops that the unions have announced the first day of mobilisation, they're calling it, basically industrial action, strikes. That's going to be January the 19th. So put that date in your diaries and get ready for what happens on January the 19th. Ronald Fulkar in Lancaster in northwestern England. Let's come back to you, sir. Ronald Fulkar is from the Lancaster University Management School. First strike day is announced, Ronald. More to come, perhaps. How would you advise the government to manage the situation going forward?
Well, I'm pretty sure that Emmanuel Macron is going to take the Nicolas Sarkozy playbook, except that Nicolas Sarkozy wanted to be re-elected. Emmanuel Macron doesn't want to be re-elected. So no, he found a majority. There was some doubt until yesterday whether the right would be on board, but as Andrew explained, it's basically a deal of the right wing, so they will support it in Parliament, which means that there will be 20 days at most of debate in Parliament, most likely a lot of filibuster. There will be no discussion, actually, because people will just be angry. Then it will go to the Senate, then it will go back, and then it will be voted. So I guess by the summer, it's over. My expectation is that Emmanuel Macron will just push through, close his eyes, close his ears, and wait for it to go through, and then it will be done. No, it's a bit sad because there will be no debate. And, you know, I'm a bit sad to listen to the two previous people who seem to have not really to talk from the same planet. I'm very sad to hear the concerns of Charlotte about inequality not being taken into account. At the same time, it's also, in my opinion, a bit crazy that a major source of inequality is intergenerational. And whenever you have a country like France where on average, I'm taking on average, people who are retired are better off than people who are working, but people who are working have been asked a lot of sacrifice, including the COVID debt is something that they will have to shoulder. It's a bit, to me, difficult not to take into account that intergenerational equality and not to have a serious conversation about, yes, it's a scandal that people will be 65-year-old and then with a very low life expectancy because they did a very difficult job, and that those people will have no choice but to retire later. That's a big problem, but it's also a problem that you have this younger generation that has been through the financial crisis, the COVID crisis, the current energy crisis. They are the ones who will have to repay all the debt, and you're just asking them, don't worry, it will be all right. No, it will not be all right. When the course says that it might be sustainable, it is with more money from the government. And more money from the government means more money from younger people. So there are different kind of trade-offs. I think my friend on the right seemed to be only concerned about one of them, which is the budget sustainability. And my friend on the left seemed to be only concerned about the fact that within a generation, some people are treated differently. But there is also a massive intergenerational problem.
I'm not from the right, but...
No, sorry, from the right of the left. You are from the right of the left, are you? On that debate, at least,
The right of the
you
center.
seem to be following those kind of ideas. I'm not judging it. I think you both have valid concerns, but I think the intergenerational dimension is something very few people seem to care about or notice. And maybe I'm afraid it's because older people vote. They vote more, and they also vote more for the center and the right. So I guess it's easier to protect them somehow. But I'm a bit surprised not to see the left or the green care about this intergenerational justice and the fact that young people are the ones who will have to shoulder the bill if you don't do anything about pensions.
Ronald Fulkar, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Charlotte Minviel, and then I'll come to you, Thierry Masson, in Brussels, for a reaction. Obviously, Charlotte, you heard what Ronald was saying, and I saw you shaking your head. So.
Yes, I think our stance are often caricaturized, but no, it was interesting to hear Ronald say, it's the young people who are going to have to pay. I mean, it's not all young people who are going to have to pay in this instance. I mean, the fact that if we really come back to who is going to work longer, it's people who are in most painful jobs once again, and I was saying earlier, a quarter of people who are the poorest are actually dead by the time they reach 62. So there's huge inequality there. And I think also if we look, there is financial sustainability in this reform. And to go back at what tools Emmanuel Macron is going to use, I tend to agree that the government is going to try to force through. We've seen that they've deployed the Article 49.3 multiple amount of times. And we've seen that that's what Sarkozy did when he pushed through. There's only 2 times that Emmanuel Macron actually backtracked in his previous term. The first time was with the Notre-Dame-des-Landes airport, when there was a huge uprising against the construction of that airport. And then when the Gilets jaunes were out in the streets protesting over a quite unfair carbon tax, which was actually going to be the same for everyone, the same for the poor, and that wasn't going to support them in any way. So that was quite unfair. And I think in this case, we don't want to get to the stage where there's going to be such unpopular unrest that we're going to be in that situation.
So was the strength of the system before Macron started to try to reform it was that there were different aspects for different people, different pension programs, 42 in all, which seems incredibly complicated if you're from a country where there is this one system. But in a sense, what you're saying is that would break down to actually help people in a almost custom-made way.
Well, I think, I'm not against the simplification of a system, and I think there were things to do, as he did back in 2018. But I think this system is definitely unfair. And to come back to the intergenerational element of this, I think this reform goes against actually supporting efforts towards the climate crisis. It's a reform that's focused on economic growth. If we look at some of the measures that are more progressive in terms of actually working less, in terms of looking at a 4-day week, in terms of thinking of our quality of life, of our well-being, this goes totally against that. So I think now we need to think, is Emmanuel Macron going to be the president of the most favored people in society, or is he actually going to do something that protects our just and fair pension system and that is going to take us forward and that is going to be supportive of future generations?
Charlotte, thank you very much indeed. Bruno Le Maire, Finance Minister, says 17.7 billion euros every year will be generated by this making people work longer. And he and Prime Minister Borne say that'll be used to finance the whole thing. So it's not money used to be spent on a different part of the public spending area. It's for pensions. That's what they're saying now. Will that hold? We don't know. And we can just tell you as well that the unions have announced the first day of mobilisation or strike action will be January the 19th. Andrew Smith in London, lecturer in modern French history at Queen Mary's. I know you've been following this intently, and I know you've got lots to say, but I'm going to start by asking you, do you think that this reform will make or break Emmanuel Macron's legacy?
I think it will, in many ways, because we've already seen the sobriquet of President of the Rich is one that's stuck with him for a long time. People have tried to define what an idea of Macronism means, whether it becomes something about the nation state or whether it becomes something instead about the idea of earning more and trying to support a growth agenda. I think this will come to define Macron's term. I think his response to many of these protests will also be one of the things that defines him. Of course, we saw people like Mitterrand talked about, the idea that you could retire at 60, enfant vivre, you can suddenly live after all of this. I think for Macron, it's very much this idea of enfant travailler. This is about the sense that people will work longer. The idea is that more people will be working. Bruno Le Maire, of course, said, old people can, instead of just retiring, they can combine it with some work and all the rest. This is, I think, going to be something which is an erosion of many of these social rights that France has treasured. But it is also quite a defining moment for Macron as someone who is able to try and present France as that trusted partner in Europe. So it's a real balancing of that fiscal agenda with that kind of erosion of social rights, really moving France in a particular direction. So I think there will be lots to be said about this in terms of Macron's legacy.
Indeed. In many ways, we're living with a series of contradictions here, aren't we? But just picking up, I'm staying with you, Andrew, just picking up on what Charlotte was saying about the Gilets jaunes situation. Is there a parallel with the Gilets jaunes situation? Perhaps I think it could be said with that carbon tax. President Macron was kind of out of step with what ordinary people were going through. I remember speaking to people in Clermont-Ferrand at the time. And to them, the idea of putting up diesel prices would have put, say, a travelling blacksmith going from farm to farm effectively out of business. Now, that was something that the Parisian elite, as they see it, didn't get, i.e., and they said, President Macron. Is there a similar issue here, do you think, that there's a kind of disconnect between the president, the Parisian elite, and what people are going through on a daily basis?
I think it will depend on how they're able to present this to the public. The unions, of course, are going to lead on this issue of the raised retirement age. That is the big issue, the big fighting issue, which people will try to combat. We've seen new developments in terms of union politics, of course, with the train ticket controllers strikes just before Christmas, and new types of union strike that mirrored some of the mobilisation of the Gilets jaunes. There is the potential for that type of growth to go ahead. However, if Macron can instead mar this in debate, work around the complications about contributions and about qualifying, annuities and all these kind of things, then I think people will lose interest and they'll be distracted by other things. So it's really, I think, going to be about how this plays out. Will it be won on the streets, or can there be a longer game played, which allows people, like boiled frogs almost, to kind of be part of this longer-term reform, which will, I think, quite dramatically change France's pension regime.
Andrew Smith, thank you very much indeed. Ronald Fulkar, I hope you were listening to all of that, because I'm coming to you now at Lancaster University Management School up there in my favourite region, the northwest of England. 17.7 billion, that figure from Bruno Le Maire. Is that going to do the trick, do you think? Is that enough?
If you look at the different scenario of the COR, so the impact evaluation of the reform that was done previously, it's in that ballpark. Of course, there are a lot of assumptions made about life expectancy, about migration number, which are forecast to be relatively low in that forecast. There are different possible scenarios, but somehow it seems to be something in terms of amount reasonable. And that's why I think, as a starting point, as much as I'm sympathetic to the argument that a lot of people will be in a terrible situation at 65 and that this is relatively unfair, it's difficult not to think about if you refuse that and you don't offer an alternative, then it means that you don't care about those 16 billion, which means that those 16 billion that you're not willing to use for something else. And then if I can come back just briefly to the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Jacket story, I think there is something in common that is very peculiar, is the fact that people who seem to be pretty good technocrats who understand that, a carbon tax is a good idea, I think sustainability of the pension system is a good idea, seem to be very unable to think about the distributive consequence of what they do. And in particular, they don't seem to be able to understand that as much as an economist, I care about incentives, helping people make choices that are good. A lot of people don't have the choice. And those people who don't have the choice, the Yellow Jacket, they were starting with the people living in remote Brittany who don't have the choice to drive long distances. Here for the pension is those people who at 65 will be in poor health and won't have the choice. Well, those people seem to be completely out of the equation of the people who surround Macron, which means that those policies sometimes seem to be very brutal and unfair, because I don't think he has the kind of advisors who would maybe tap in on the shoulder and think, hey, have you thought about that? That might be a possible reaction of the public.
Bruno, thank you very much indeed. Let's, on the back of that, bring in Thierry Masson of French People Living Abroad. Thierry's in Brussels. Thierry, the reforms coming from President Macron, being conveyed by Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne, essentially, some might say, out of touch. The unions completely agree it's out of touch. They've announced their first day of mobilisation for January the 19th. What would you say, sir? You've already said that changes need to happen. Can those changes happen, do you think? Is that what should happen straight away? Or is there a case, as we've been trying to sort of make here, that perhaps the president's out of touch a little bit?
Just perhaps to redo the story a bit. We've spent now several weeks with the Labour Minister, Olivier Dussopt, who has talked to all the trade unions. And the trade unions stayed until the end to discuss on the potential, on the content of the reform. I think one important element when you do this comparison with the Yellow Vest is that the French know that there is a need for reform. It's true that there is discontentment with the legal age, so this point of the reform, but there are other points on the reform. And one of the person intervening today was saying that I was focusing on the balance of the public debt and so on. There are three pillars for this reform: the balance, that's true, but also the justice and the social progress. And I think on these aspects, there are some room of maneuver in order to improve further the reform. But the reform that we have proposed now, that the Prime Minister has presented today, is, as one of the speakers was saying, already very different. So there has been a social dialogue. I think this will be recognized. We now have to go through the parliamentary process. And this parliamentary process can also lead to some adjustments, in particular on the justice or social progress aspects. And there will also be the debate in the Senate. So I think the legislation and the law is done in the parliament. And that's where we should now focus the effort.
I'm not quite sure whether you said you think the president's out of touch or not, but I'll take your answer as it was, Thierry, and thank you very much for that.
Excuse me?
I'm not quite sure whether you said, I asked you whether you thought Macron was out of touch or whether he was in tune with what people need and want. I'm not quite sure whether you answered that for me, but you certainly gave us a thorough response on how this thing will be debated, and hopefully things will come from that. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. Charlotte, can I bring you in? Because if in the world of business something is set up where you're paying out at one end because people are contributing at the other end, that gets prosecuted as a Ponzi scheme and people go to jail. A pension system, which depends on, as they all do, people working and contributing, so people at the other end can take the money out, is in a similar system. At some point, there comes a problem where you need to sort of make the books balance. So the reform is needed, isn't it?
Well, I think, I'm not against certain reform of the pension system. I'm against this reform of the pension system. And again, I think to say that this is a necessity and an urgency, it's actually a political will and a conservative political will. So I want to go back to what Andrew was saying. I'm in total agreement about the fact that I think this portrays Macron as a president of the rich. He also referred to Mitterrand, and one of the things that the first thing actually, there were polls asking what is the one thing that people remember from Mitterrand's term, and it was the retirement age at 60.
I was going to say abolishing the death penalty, but you...
Yes, well, there many things, but that's really one of them. And I think and you were asking as well, is Macron out of touch? I think he definitely is out of touch with this very unpopular reform. We've seen it on other things, the carbon tax with the Gilets jaunes, but also with the wealth tax, the ESF measure. Those were reforms that were going in favor of the wealthiest. I have to stop you and throw in, obviously, Elisabeth Borne talking about obviously sort of more money to bring people's pensions up, to help give some pensioners who are currently struggling more, and of course what she's trying to do for people on the SMIC, the minimum wage as well. Isn't that a sense of trying to use the phrase of the UK government, level up? No, but the thing is, we're currently in a situation where there is a little gap, but the system is going to even out. It's going to be sustainable if we look at the long term, because we're currently looking at from a very short term perspective. But the Koch report of experts on pensions show us that in the long term this is going to even out. So this is currently not an emergency that we're facing. And what I'd like to also say about what Renaud was saying, let's have a debate in Parliament. I'm totally not opposed to us having a dialogue, but if we look at how the government has currently behaved since Macron's term, we've had 49.3 over and over, and actually the government has opposed a lot of our amendments on many things. They've opposed our amendments on the insulation of homes, they've opposed our amendments on investing in the railway system, lots of things that are effective to counter a climate crisis. So I have a lot of doubts that they will be willing to enter in a dialogue with us, contrary to one of our guests are saying. So I really encourage people to support the strike that has been announced by the unions on the 19th of January. I think we need to mobilize to oppose this unfair system. There's lots of other injustices in our current pension system. One of them, which might interest your viewers, is that there's also an injustice in French people living abroad and the way that their retirement is calculated when they move back to France, actually. And some of our Green senators, Mélanie Vogel, for example, have raised this question with the government, and there hasn't been any answers. So there's lots of injustices that we need to address. Let's talk about them, but let's not get blocked in the way that it's being done now.
Charlotte Minviel doing my job for me and directing me straight to Thierry Masson for a comment on that one. Are you in this position that Charlotte's talking about, Thierry, that your pension will be affected by the fact that you're based and presumably working in Brussels? Thierry Masson, I'll try you again. Will your pension be affected by the things?
I cannot hear very, very well.
Okay. We were discussing the idea here that the possibility of being a French person living, working abroad, it affects how your pension is calculated and how your pension will be finalised come the end of your career. Is that something you're aware of? Is that something you're hoping will change?
Are you talking about me personally?
Oh, I mean, you personally, but you can broaden it out to talk about French people in general, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure I got the questions, but I think what is interesting to see when I hear my colleague from the left is that the more and more you go into details on what would be the solution, the alternative solution that they would propose in order to solve the issue, the clearer it is that there is actually no solution which is proposed. I heard talking about the 4 days week. I heard talking about raising taxes for the French people or for the businesses. And I think with this kind of solution, it's clear that in view of the other the European partners, we would not be seen as someone who is able to actually move forward. So I'm really puzzled by the solutions that are put forward by my colleague.
Thierry, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Renaud for perhaps the final word on this debate. Renaud, in terms of what happens next, how important is it that the government, President Macron, Prime Minister Borne, manage this situation well?
Well, as you might have noticed, in France there is always a risk of people being angry, demonstrating and blocking the country. So I am a bit concerned when people try to pass en force and to go a bit tone deaf in a reform. I'm sort of expecting that this is not going to be as important as the yellow jacket. So I think at the moment, because also Macron has been elected and re-elected on this idea of pension reform, there is some form of resignation that it will happen. I might be wrong. Somehow, as much as I share the concern of people caring about inequity, I'm not sure a long-term social unrest is a good idea either. So I will wait and see.
Dr. Ronald Fulkar of Lancaster University's Management School up there in the northwest of England. Thank you, sir. Thanks to Dr. Andrew Smith, lecturer in modern French history at Queen Mary's in London. Thank you to Thierry Masson, president of French People Living Abroad, who joined us in Brussels. And thank you to Charlotte Minviel of the French Green Party in the UK here in the studio. Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks to you for watching. We'll follow the story for you here in France 24. Stay with us.